One morning, the little bee woke up inside the hive. She blinked her eyes and looked around. The hive was warm, safe, and filled with buzzing bees. A new day was starting. The little bee stretched and yawned, noticing the sunlight shining into the hive. The hive was a place where everything was in order and everyone had a job to do. The queen bee was the most important member of the hive. Her job was to lay eggs and fill the hive with new bees. Worker bees had many different jobs, gathering pollen, cleaning the hive, and caring for the young bees. The little bee flew deep into the hive and met the majestic queen bee. The queen bee was calm but powerful. Being near her made the little bee feel very special. Queen bee: "Today is your first day of gathering pollen. Are you ready, little bee?" The little bee flew around the hive, watching how the other worker bees busily worked. Some were making honey, some were taking care of the newborn bees, and some were cleaning. Each worker bee had a job. Some gathered pollen, some made honey, and others kept the hive clean. The little bee approached the entrance of the hive, ready to head out. She took a deep breath. Today she would explore the colorful world, gather pollen from flowers, and return to the hive. Today she would venture into the colorful world, collect pollen from flowers, and return to the hive. Section 2. Exploring the flowers. For the first time, the little bee flew out of the hive and saw the colorful world around her. The sky was bright blue, and the green fields stretched far below. As the little bee soared through the sky, she marveled at the beauty of nature. The vast green fields below and the vibrant flowers filled her with awe. Everywhere she looked, there were flowers of different shapes, sizes, and colors. Red, yellow, purple, and pink flowers bloomed all around her. The flowers were not only beautiful, but also released sweet fragrances that filled the air. The little bee could smell their delightful scent as she flew closer. The little bee flew closer to the flowers, fascinated by their vibrant colors and the sweet scent they'd released. She hovered nearby, drawn to their beauty. Each flower seemed to call out to her with its own unique smell and color. The bright petals and glowing hues of the flowers made them irresistible. Bees are attracted to flowers because of their bright colors and their nectar. The nectar helps the flowers grow and spread, while the bees gather pollen for the hive. Flowers grow through a process called photosynthesis. They use sunlight to turn water and air into food, allowing them to bloom in beautiful colors. The little bee landed gently on a bright yellow flower to collect her first batch of pollen. The flower was large and inviting, with its glowing center full of pollen. As the bee began collecting pollen, she noticed another bee landing on the same flower. The two bees greeted each other warmly. "Hello," said the second bee. "Isn't this a lovely flower?" The little bee smiled and agreed, enjoying the moment. The two bees shared a moment of delight as they worked together to collect pollen. It was a joyful experience working side by side. After gathering the pollen, the little bee thanked her new friend and flew off to explore more flowers. She waved goodbye as she soared into the sky. As the little bee flew through the field, she felt a sense of joy and excitement for her next adventure. The colorful flowers below filled her with energy. There were still so many flowers to explore, and the little bee couldn't wait to visit them all. She flew off into the distance, ready for her next adventure. Section 3. The Pollen Collection Adventure. The little bee set off on her new mission, collecting pollen from as many flowers as possible. She buzzed through the air, excited about the day's adventure. The first flower she landed on was a large red one, and she quickly began gathering the golden pollen inside. The flower welcomed her, its petals wide open. As she moved from flower to flower, the little bee encountered a ladybug resting on a leaf. The ladybug waved hello with a smile. Next, the little bee flew to a tall yellow flower where a butterfly was fluttering nearby. "Isn't this a beautiful day?" the butterfly asked. The little bee agreed, enjoying the warmth of the sun as she continued to collect pollen. She then saw a line of ants carrying food across the ground below. The little bee knew that collecting pollen was important. Flowers needed bees to help them spread their pollen so that new flowers could grow. As the little bee gathered more and more pollen, she thought about how this would help the flowers grow and spread their seeds, keeping the cycle of life going. Suddenly, she spotted a very large and unusual flower in the distance. It was bigger than any flower she had ever seen before. The little bee landed on the giant flower, but something was different. The petals were too slippery, and she couldn't seem to collect the pollen easily. Determined to gather the pollen, the little bee kept trying. But just as she was about to succeed, dark clouds gathered in the sky. A strong wind began to blow, and the little bee knew a storm was coming. She needed to find shelter quickly before the rain began to fall. The wind pushed the little bee around as she tried to fly back toward the hive. She spotted a tree with a small hole in it, just big enough to take shelter. Safely inside the tree, the little bee listened to the rain and thunder outside. She was safe now, but she hoped the storm would pass soon. After a while, the storm finally passed. The sun came out again, and the little bee emerged from the tree ready to continue her pollen collection. With the storm behind her, the little bee felt even more determined. There were still so many flowers to help, and she was ready to return to her mission. Section 4. The Storm and the Safe Haven. The little bee was happily collecting pollen from flowers when the sky suddenly grew dark. She looked up and saw thick clouds gathering quickly. Before she knew it, a strong wind began to blow, and heavy raindrops started to fall from the sky. The little bee's wings struggled against the wind. The little bee realized she needed to find shelter fast. She spotted a large tree nearby with a hollow in the trunk. The little bee flew into the tree's hollow just as the rain became heavier. Inside, it was dry and safe. The little bee sighed with relief. As she settled in, the little bee noticed she wasn't alone. A small ant and a beetle had also taken shelter in the tree. "Hello," said the ant. "We're lucky to have found this shelter in time." The beetle nodded in agreement. The little bee and her new friends talked about how important it was to find shelter during a storm. They all agreed that storms can be very dangerous for small creatures like them. The storm outside raged on, but inside the tree it was peaceful. They listened to the rain and thunder while they waited for the storm to pass. Finally, the storm began to clear. The little bee peeked outside and saw the sun breaking through the clouds. It was time to return to the flowers. The little bee said goodbye to her new friends and flew back out into the bright world. She was ready to finish her pollen-collecting mission. Section 5. Returning to the hive and the honey-making process. The little bee flew back toward the hive, carrying all the pollen she had collected. The hive was buzzing with activity as the other bees were hard at work. As soon as the little bee entered the hive, she headed straight to the honeycomb where the worker bees were ready to help. The little bee began unloading the pollen she had collected. The other bees worked together to turn the pollen into nectar, a key ingredient for honey making. Once the nectar was ready, the bees began to transform it into honey. They placed it carefully inside the hexagon-shaped cells of the honeycomb. The bees then used their wings to fan the honey, drying it out and making it thick and golden. It was a delicate and important process. As the little bee watched the process, she remembered how bees communicated with each other through special dances. The waggle dance was a way for bees to tell others where to find flowers and which direction to fly. The little bee had learned this dance and often used it to help her fellow bees. After the honey was made, the bees carefully sealed the honeycomb with wax to keep it fresh and protected. The little bee felt proud as she looked at the honeycomb, now filled with delicious honey. She knew she had played an important role in this process. The hive buzzed with happiness and activity. The bees continued to work together, filling the honeycomb with honey and keeping the hive running smoothly. Section 6. Meeting the Queen. Bee. The little bee, after a long day of work, was ready for something special, meeting the queen bee. She buzzed excitedly as she flew toward the royal chamber. As she entered the royal chamber, the little bee was in awe of how grand it was. In the center sat the majestic queen bee, much larger and more regal than the others. The queen bee was surrounded by worker bees who took care of her and brought her food. She needed special care to stay strong and healthy. The queen bee was responsible for laying eggs and ensuring the future of the hive. Her role was to keep the colony growing by laying thousands of eggs. As the little bee approached, she felt a sense of honor. The queen bee was the most important member of the hive, and all bees respected her deeply. The queen bee noticed the little bee and smiled warmly. "You've done a great job collecting pollen today," said the queen. "The hive thrives because of bees like you." The little bee bowed her head respectfully. She felt proud to be part of such an organized and hard-working hive. The queen bee's presence reminded all the bees of their purpose. Each bee had a role, and together they kept the hive strong and healthy. After her meeting with the queen, the little bee flew back to her place in the hive, feeling fulfilled and ready to continue her work. The hive buzzed with life as all the bees worked together. The little bee knew that by working as a team, they could keep the hive thriving for many years to come. Section 7. Night and Rest. As the day came to an end, the little bee flew back to the hive, feeling tired but satisfied with her work. The sun was setting, painting the sky with beautiful colors. Entering the hive, the little bee made her way to the special resting area where bees go to relax and recharge after a long day. The little bee found a comfortable spot and curled up. Bees often rest together in the hive, creating a warm and safe environment for everyone. As the night deepened, the hive became quiet. The little bee listened to the soft buzzing sounds of her fellow bees resting nearby. While resting, the little bee began to dream. In her dream, she imagined herself flying over fields of flowers, collecting pollen under a bright sun. In her dream, the little bee explored various landscapes filled with different flowers, each one more beautiful than the last. The little bee discovered new types of flowers she had never seen before. She felt a sense of adventure and excitement in her dream. As the night went on, the little bee's dreams became even more magical, filled with dancing flowers and swirling colors. Suddenly, the little bee woke up feeling refreshed and ready for another day. She realized how important it was to rest and recharge. As dawn broke, the little bee felt grateful for her home and all the wonderful adventures that awaited her in the day ahead.